I'll tell you how it got started and where it came from. And then I can talk about anything you want to talk about. If you have questions about what it's like to be a poet laureate, I have to start there because it is a pretty bizarre thing at first. And they do. But I thought what I'd do first is start with this poem, and then I'll maybe do a poem from the book that Lenny brought in. Because your librarian brought this up to me to sign. It's a poem, and it'll be in your library then afterwards. This poem is I'll read it twice. I sometimes think it's better to read things because when you read it in a book, you have the luxury of doing it at any time you want to and reading over and over again. When I read it aloud, you only get one shot. So I'll read it once, and then I'll talk about it a little bit, then I'll read it again. And it's called Shirt-Sleeved Afternoons. Shirt-sleeved afternoons turn toward leather as the trees blush, scatter a last few bright, weary wisps across the great bruised heart of the South. The spirit cup drifts down the pond's moon-sparked highway. Far laughter, shadows. Love or poison? Your turn. Drink to the star-drenched latitudes. That's a pretty thick poem, actually, for being pretty short. This poem came about because of a request by several poets who wanted to do an American ranga. And a ranga is a form of poem where it comes from the Japanese. What they used to do would have these drinking games where you would sit around a pond and someone would speak a poem. And then they would drink from a cup, which they would then put on a lily pad or some floating tray, and they'd push it toward someone else. They would drift toward someone. Whoever it landed at would have to fill the cup, drink, and then respond with a short poem. Of course, by the end of the evening, these poems got pretty weird. But what would happen is you had to take, in the modern day ranga, you would have to take the last line or phrase of the person who spoke before and use it as your first line, right? So that it made this chain that went on and on and on. And so the idea was to have poets write these short poems and then send it on to the next poet. And so I got my first line was the last line of someone else's, Shirt-Sleeved Afternoons. And then I took it and wrote mine and sent it on to someone else. And it stretched all across the United States. The poems came from all sorts of places. And I decided because the poem was about, the final poem, the huge poem, was really going to be a poem about all the many different places that we come from, both spiritually and, in terms of our families, in terms of our heritage, and in terms of our landscape. I decided to really write about right where I was at that moment, which was Virginia. And Virginia is the South, kind of. They don't think of themselves as the South, they think of themselves as Virginians. But it's kind of the South, and because of that, you have things in there like the great bruised heart of the South, which refers to lots of things, particularly the Civil War. And also you have the change of the seasons, which is different than here. I lived for, a friend and I lived for 8 years in Tempe, Arizona, so yeah, this is kind of like a homecoming. It's wonderful. And it's also amazing, a little aside, our daughter just got her first job at Arizona State University. And she's 29 years old, and I was 29 years old when I got my first job, which happened to be at Arizona State University. Twilight Zone. But the one thing I missed, having come from the Midwest, were the changing of the seasons, with, with trees dropping their leaves, and so I had to get the leaves dropping in there. which is what that means with the trees blush, scatter a few bright, weary wisps, you know, so beautiful colored leaves that fall down. And also, and this is something which is different here, but the very beginning, the shirt-sleeved afternoons turn toward leather. I mean, here, that's happening now, but it happens in the course of a day, right? You start out in shirt-sleeves, you end up in, you know, something to keep you warm. So that was really how the poem, my part of the poem started, and I referred to that old drinking game, too, at the end when I said the spirit cup drifts. It's not only the cup of spirits that actually drifts across the pond, but maybe even the moon, right? Because the spirit cup drifts down the pond's moon-spawned highway. So it's I also think it's a poem about you have to make do with what you get. You have to choose, you know, you get your cards handed, you get your situations handed to you, your cup floats to you, right? Are you going to make it a good poem, or are you going to squander that chance? It's up to you. Is it love or poison? It's your turn. So that's basically what the poem's about. I'll read it again. Shirt-sleeved afternoons turn toward leather as the trees blush, scatter a last few bright, weary wisps across the great bruised heart of the south. The spirit cup drifts down the pond's moon-sparked highway. Far laughter, shadows. Love or poison? Your turn. Drink to the star-drenched glad tips. Questions about anything? I know you have questions.
Tell us a little bit about being Poet Laureate.
Okay, about being Poet Laureate. Well, the first question that I had when I was asked if I would take on the position was, well, who chose me? You know, because it's a bit of a mystery, and it still remains a bit of a mystery. The Librarian of Congress, who is the chief librarian of the country, makes the final decision, but he consults with a group of people, both poets, critics, writers, all sorts of folks, and makes his final decision. All I know, I do not know who was involved in choosing me or anything. I do know that they on the slide, they were kind of vetting me before they even asked me, because I found out later from somebody who knew somebody that they had been asked if I was a people person. Whatever that means. But when I got the Poet Laureateship was really kind of fantastic. First of all, it's amazing, it's wonderful that there's even a poetry office at all. And there is a poetry office in Washington, D.C., at the Library of Congress, right under the cupola. It looks down on Congress, which is a really nice touch. You can kind of look down on it. And it's not paid by taxpayers' money because of very wealthy woman donated the money at one point. And when I got there, I had two questions. I came to look at the place. I said, well, what are my duties? What does a Poet Laureate do? And the official thing is that you're to promote poetry in the United States in any way that you see fit. Like, that's it? No, but that's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, what they do, the idea was to give you latitude to do whatever you, to do it the way you wanted to do it. And then I asked what my budget was, and I got a funny stare. And so I decided that I would simply do until they stopped me, figuring that they would find the money if it was something that worked. And they found the money. I don't know. It was very busy. It's a very busy team. Government is strange. But there were times when they said we don't have the money to do that, but then they found it. So that's good. What I found out was that basically it's a little like being Miss America for poetry. It's a little like getting a spotlight, and then people notice that there's a poet laureate, and then they come up to you with ideas. It's like being a lightning rod in a way. And I was just immediately inundated with letters from people who, there were two things that emerged with these letters. One of them was that they came from everywhere and from all walks of life. I was stunned. I think that I thought that poetry was not doing so well in the United States. What I found was that poetry was underground. People loved to read, but they were afraid that they didn't understand it. Therefore, they didn't talk to anyone about it. So almost every other letter would start with, "I don't know much about poetry," or "I don't understand poetry." Then there would come that great word, "but." But I remember when I was a child and I got my first book out of the mobile library in Kansas. I ran in there quickly to get it, and it was a book of poems, and I was so disappointed, but it was the quickest one I could get off the shelf, and I really, really loved it. It changed my life. You know, those kind of letters, I thought, okay, we got to work on this fear. And so I decided that what I should do is to try to put poetry wherever I could. And so I basically had to make up my own program, and that meant doing things, going places where people didn't think poetry ever tread, you know. So so I was on Sesame Street. That was fun. Big Birds, very big. And went to the Naval Academy, and every time I was invited to say a few words at some, you know, government thing, which is always a euphemism for "can you read a poem?" I would go, because I thought, let's put some poetry into these dry proceedings. One thing that's different between the American Poet Laureate and the British Poet Laureate, for instance, is that the British Poet Laureate actually has to compose poems for special occasions, like the Queen, you know, the Queen's cat, stuff like that, birthday. The American Poet Laureate does not. There are no obligations to write special poems. But I think I found there's always a poem for every occasion. You can find them. You know, they're there. Because poems are about life. They aren't about books. They appear in books, but they're about life. About hopefully every emotion that we have and every strange situation that we ever find ourselves in, a poem can handle it. And therefore, if someone says, say a few words at the swearing in of a judge, hey, there's something for that, you know, or to say a few words to Big Bird. So that's how that happened, and then I did a couple of things bringing poetry. There was a poetry series every other week. There was a budget to invite poets, and one of the things that I decided to mix it up a few times. I had some jazz musicians come in, and poets read first, then the jazz musicians played, and then they improvised together, and that was fun to do. And I invited a group of pro-Indian children to come to Washington to read, because I knew that they'd been writing poetry, and that was a phenomenal experience because they came back with several demands, which I thought were very reasonable, which was they said, you know, the parents have to come, and chaperones. I said, yep, that's right, we'll find money for that. And then they said they wanted to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and they wanted to talk to their representative, which was great. It was great. They went over to Congress, they met with the representative who was going to give them a speech, and they said, no, first let us read to you our poems about where we live. They just rocked it. They really took it. I mean, it was great. It was great. So it was a wonderful experience, and every poet laureate comes up with a different idea of how they want to, you know, bring poetry out to the people, and you know, that's what makes it so great. It was a 2-year stint for me, 1 year renewable, and they renewed me, so I was there for 2 years, and it was wonderful. It was really great. So, any other questions?
You spoke of Americans' difficulty with interpreting poetry. You interpreted a poem for us today. Are there any poems, just like due to their personal nature or the changing meaning through the passage of time, that you won't interpret for people?
Oh, well, I feel like that everyone should just come to a poem, and if it speaks to you, let it speak, and if it doesn't, then you can move on, and it might speak to you later. In other words, I actually am fairly loath to interpret my poems for people. I did it with that poem particularly because it was a special, assignment. I knew that without seeing the entire poem, it might be difficult to see where it kind of came from. But the thing that's hard about poetry, interpreting poetry, especially when you're in school, is that poems are calculated. Poems are written so that they touch you so deeply that you're speechless afterwards, right? Supposedly the best words, the best words. If they strike you speechless, how can you write a paper? Now, any sort of translation is impossible, but thank God we have translation. I mean, it's impossible to render something in another language, but you just go ahead and do it. So what you do is you learn to talk about the unspeakable, and you acknowledge the fact that there are things in the poem that move you to breathlessness. And then after that, you can write it. But don't be afraid. If you approach it with fear, you're never going to understand it. You'll tighten up. You will never get anything out of it. If you open yourself to possibility, then whatever comes through, is, you can get it out on paper too. So, yeah. It's a hope.
Thank you.
Uh-oh. No. What? You have to go to class.
Oh my gosh.
All right.
Thanks, give
Thank you so much.
But there's two Native American books that we read here that the students really like, so we thought you might like one is Two Old Women, that I think all of you have read, Athabascan.
Yes.
And we were lucky to have Leanne Howe come here from the Navajo Nation. So he did seminars. We have another present.
On behalf of all of us here at St. Michael High School, we would like to present this from our heart to you.
So you guys know
Our heart to your heart.
from my heart to yours. Thank you. Thank you.